Hi, my name is Brianna Keenan, and I'm a fourth-year doctoral candidate at Tulane working with Dr. Julie Marquant. This poster is examining how distractor contexts might differentially drive attention orienting and holding mechanisms to caregiver and stranger faces during infancy. I'll be walking through each section of this poster verbally, beginning in the left panel labeled Introduction. So if you're listening to just the narration right now, I recommend clicking on that section now to expand it. From past research, we know that infants rely on both attention orienting and attention holding mechanisms to learn about faces, which are a really rich source of information in an infant's life. Attention orienting is more of a selective attention mechanism that describes the ability to select a stimulus out among competing distractors, whereas attention holding reflects more of a sustained attention mechanism and is the process of maintaining attention on a stimulus for an extended duration of time. A few studies have successfully demonstrated that infants look longer at caregiver faces compared to stranger faces, suggesting a caregiver attention holding bias. However, these studies are often done when the distractor context is pretty scarce and few items compete for the infant's attention. A separate line of work, though, has identified that infants reliably orient to stranger faces appearing among distracting images by 6 months or so. So this suggests a general face attention orienting bias. However, we don't know if the same holds true for the highly relevant and motivating caregiver faces, or if these biases are different depending on the identity of the face, being a caregiver versus a stranger. So this leads us to the two research questions for this project. The first of which being, do infants demonstrate attention biases to caregiver faces in context with multiple competing distractors? And second, do these biases vary depending on age or the selective attention demands of the distractor context? Our participants so far includes 24 infants, half of whom are 6 months of age and the other half are 9 months of age. We do plan to collect more data when we're allowed to do in-person testing again. So keep in mind that these results I'll be presenting are preliminary at the moment. And these participants completed a visual search task that we developed that includes trials with varying selective attention demands. So I recommend clicking on the figure now to expand this image. The left and middle trial types will be referred to as single target trials. These trials had 5 non-face distractors and only 1 face. The face was either their caregiver's face or a stranger's face. And during these trials, we considered selective attention demands to be relatively low, since only 1 face target was appearing at a time. So these 2 faces were not in direct competition during single target trials. In contrast, the trial type on the right shows a distractor context with relatively higher selective attention demands. So on these dual target trials, both the caregiver and the stranger faces were appearing simultaneously. The 2 faces were placed in direct competition, which increased the need for infants to rely on their visual selective attention to resolve the conflict between these 2 faces. Each infant viewed 6 arrays per trial type, so 18 trials total for 4 seconds each. And we use an iLink 1000 plus eye tracking system to collect the visual fixation data throughout the task. The 2 main measures of attention I'm presenting here today are attention holding and orienting. Attention holding was calculated by the duration of looking to the face stimulus, whereas orienting was calculated by the eye movement response time that it took for the infant to look at the face. So now you can go ahead and click on that middle panel that shows the results of this study. We found that attention orienting biases depended on age and selective attention demands. So 6-month-old infants showed no differences to caregivers versus stranger across the 2 trial types. However, 9-month-olds showed faster attention orienting to stranger faces on dual target trials when both of those faces were appearing simultaneously. We similarly found that attention holding biases depended on age and selective attention demands. So 6-month-olds again showed no differences to caregivers versus strangers across the 2 trial types. However, 9-month-olds looked longer at caregiver faces, but only on those single target trials when the faces were presented one at a time among the non-face distractors. So you may now click on the discussion section where I will kind of go over our interpretation of these findings, and explain the current and future directions for this work. So overall, these preliminary data show that attention biases were dependent on both distractor context and age. So on the one hand, we found that infants might be more likely to show attention orienting biases when multiple faces were competing for attention. So having these multiple faces presented at once increased the selective attention demands for the infants, which might have kind of highlighted or underscored the relevance and importance for resolving conflict among these potential target images. Where on the other hand, we found that infants might be more likely to show biased attention holding when faces were appearing without competing faces. This might be because selective attention demands were lower and allowed infants to better engage in sustained attention mechanisms for detailed processing of these two faces. We also hypothesized that these attention biases might develop a little bit more slowly in the context of competing distractors, as we only really found these effects in our 9-month-old sample. So it might be the case that infants need to develop more increased control over their attention processes in order to resolve the conflict and demonstrate these biases. And so, like I said, due to COVID-19, we've had to kind of put a pause on data collection since March of 2020. However, in the past year or so, we've been focused on a very similar project that examines whether children show similar caregiver-related attention biases using an online task. So instead of using an eye tracker now, we now are using Zoom and Pavlovia and have children compete a fully remote attention capture task that includes caregiver faces and stranger faces as task-irrelevant distractors. And then in the future, we plan to kind of go back to this project and collect more eye tracking data on these infants. We're also really curious about the role of physical salience of non-face distractors and how that physical salience might compete with the social and motivational saliency of stranger and caregiver faces. So this idea kind of stems from our recently published work finding that familiar own race faces might compete with physically salient distractors more effectively than the novel other race faces. So we're kind of curious about understanding more about how physical salience, social salience, motivational salience all kind of play together to kind of create an attentional priority map for infants and their attention orienting. And lastly, we're interested in understanding the neural correlates underlying these behavioral attention processes. So we'd like to investigate whether or not FNIRS activation in cortical reward regions associated with motivational and reward processing can predict individual differences in a behavioral task like this that measures attention biases. So thank you so much for listening to my poster presentation. I'd be so happy to chat with you during my live session on April 7th at 4:30 p.m. Eastern. Otherwise, I'd be really glad to answer any questions or discuss this project further with you at really any time. My email address is bkeenan, Keenan, @tulane.edu. I look forward to chatting with you soon.